There are over 5.6 million people who have been diagnosed with COVID-19 and nearly 346,000 deaths worldwide. In the US, there are over 1.7 million infections and more than 101,000 deaths. To put this in perspective, in 3 months, COVID-19 has killed more Americans than in any wars except World War I, II, and the Civil War. The CDC is actually reporting a forecast that we will have about 115,000 deaths by June 20th, which is approximately the number of Americans who died in World War I. The 1.7 million documented infection in the United States may actually just be the tip of the iceberg. There are no new major developments in the treatment or vaccine front. There is a report that after Gilead Sciences, the pharmaceutical that has been testing remdesivir, they donated 607,000 doses of that drug to the US government to distribute to hospitals. The report says that the federal government mishandled that distribution, and most likely many patients who needed it had a delay in receiving it. And I will want to close with some concerns about reopening based on the data. Our federal and some state governments are making decisions not always using the data, but also they are changing the data to make them fit their decisions. Already, we are seeing that 1/3 of the states are not reporting COVID hospitalization data, which is a very significant marker of an increasing pandemic. And if they're not reporting it, we're not going to know when the time comes to, after we reopen, to close again or go back to some other state. The governor of Iowa has stated that the government will not report pandemic data from meat packing plants on their data website. The District of Columbia does not meet its own criteria of having 2 weeks of decreasing number of infections before reopening. So instead of deciding not to reopen, they are now excluding infections from nursing homes, homeless shelters, and jails from their overall number, which makes it seem like an effort to change the data to fit the reopening decision. I did forget to mention that there were and this was actually pretty highly publicized, a model analysis from Columbia University researcher who basically said that if we had actually, as a country, made the decision to go to shelter in place 1 week earlier than we did, 36,000 fewer Americans would have died from the COVID pandemic so far. The way things are going, I am sure that there will be a second wave, and almost sure that it will be a significant second wave. And I think we will look back and mourn the terrible decision that will kill thousands needlessly. I just have to say that I'm not convinced that the economy is going to be helped if we reopen too early and more people will die.
The smaller companies aren't serviced by normal banks that you think of, JP Morgan or Bank of America. There's a separate financial infrastructure for them, and those organizations are called Community Development Financial Institutions, or CDFIs. And what those are basically non-bank banks. They're organizations set up explicitly to serve minority and underserved communities. So they're funded that way, they are targeted, they're much smaller, and those banks know those communities well, but that's their whole reason they exist, is that they raise capital. Sometimes they're nonprofits, sometimes they're banks, usually not. Sometimes they raise capital from the open market, but that's their strategy. So you know that if you invest in one of those CDFIs, there's about 1,100 of them across the country. In the first round of funding, only about 90 of them participated in the PPP program. The reason for that is most of them were not a part of the SBA, the Small Business Administration program. They did not know how to apply to that program because they just hadn't been doing that. That's usually done by the larger banks. They have limited capital, so it's not like you can just lend right away. And so these are smaller banking institutions, so they needed capital. And then the application process was really complicated. You had to fill out forms they hadn't filled out before, and their customers are smaller customers who basically filled out the forms incorrectly. Over half of the forms were incorrect. So it was a complicated process. Rules were changing as we were developing the program because the Fed was giving guidance, or the Treasury rather was giving guidance, so people weren't sure where to go and what to do. And so the smaller organizations like the CDFIs were just learning about all this. And the way the program was structured, it was whoever got there first and asked for the money and wrote a loan, that's where the money went. And so you can't compete with these larger banks. They have automation. You're trying to fill out a form manually online. They have AI applications called bots that are automatically filling out the forms online. So it just wasn't even a fair fight. So all the money went to the larger banks. And if you were a tiny company or a barbershop or something, you didn't have a relationship with one of those large banks, it's unlikely you would have gotten a loan, because like most businesses, they service their best customers first, whoever got there. And that's how the money got distributed. So some of these things are being addressed. I'll get to that in just a moment. The CDFIs, these smaller financial institutions, though, do need to be consistently kind of recapitalized. It means they need additional capital. So some of the things that we're doing now is the Cleveland Fed is allowing those CDFIs to come to what's called the discount window. So if you've made some loans, you can get a loan against your loan at the Cleveland Fed. That just was set up 2 weeks ago. And then another idea we're working on now is to syndicate those loans. So if you're a CDFI, you've made, let's say, $10 million worth of loans, you can bundle those into a pool and then sell them off to investors, and you get your money back and go make more loans. That's what needs to be done eventually. So anyway, that's kind of the background of where we ended up. Some of the people who are applying for loans, smaller businesses, had language issues. Remember, the CDFIs are serving specific communities. Sometimes they're speaking another language. And so they weren't able to get the forms completed in time. But going forward, we have some ideas for that. The other issue was about, especially in the Black community, almost 90% of the businesses are sole proprietorships. So you don't have a W-2, they're 1099 employees. So the example I give people, if you're a barbershop owner and you're just renting out your chairs and someone else a barber can rent those 4 chairs, you don't have W-2 employees, they're just agents of yours, your partners of yours. And so if you have to produce that documentation, and if you do a whole program based on your payroll, you're not going to be able to show that because it doesn't exist. So those are some of the issues. Another issue is by basing it on payroll, the way they did it, that the amount of money you could borrow was up to 75% based on your payroll, and it had to be used for that, and 25% for the issues. But depending on what type of business you've had, your payroll may not be your biggest cost. You may have inventory, insurance, rent, other things. And so the lack of flexibility on that was a problem for some people. They just couldn't use it as currently structured. That's being addressed in the next bill that's coming up. I'm sure the Congressman will talk about that later, what's pending, so I'll let him do that. And then it was unclear kind of how the loans were going to be forgiven. They said they're going to be forgiven, but no one likes to take money if it turns into a real loan and you have to pay it back. Some of these small companies just can't afford to have a loan that they have to pay back. So that was an issue. So the second round is going better. We're seeing the loan sizes come down, which is an indication that smaller companies are getting the funding. In the first round, the average size was $206,000, and now it's down to $115,000. So it's getting down to smaller companies, which is good. And the processing rate is better. During the first few weeks, 38% of the loans were getting through, the applications were getting through the system. 67% are getting through now. The system that's processing the loan is called eTrans. That's the SBA loan system. It's very hard to use, so people built front ends around it to try to work around it and get better at using that. But they've made progress. So where do we end up? Right now, there's a loan count. There's been 4.4 million loans that have been outstanding as of today. The CDFIs went from almost nothing to 305 of them participating now, which is good. That means it's getting out to those smaller banks and financial institutions. Just yesterday, Senator Schumer, I was on a call with him. He announced that they set aside $10 billion just for the CDFIs. So the issue I talked about earlier, where they just couldn't get the loans fast enough and they went to other banks who were faster and bigger. The way to solve that problem is just segment some money just for these smaller institutions, which is exactly what happened yesterday. So that's good news as well. So if you fast forward, of those 4.4 million loans, 2.8 million of them were for $50,000 or less as of today. So that means it's shifted. That's a good thing. Obviously, more has to happen. We need to process the rest of the funds that are outstanding. And there's still, CDFIs and companies calling me they can't get the loan, they can't get status. So it's not solved, but it's directionally getting better, I guess, is the news. We all have reason to be concerned given what's happened, and we need another stimulus. It was not big enough, didn't last long enough. The good news is most people recognize that now in the Senate and the House, and Mitch McConnell may not yet, that's our issue, but a lot of pressure has been applied to him. Steve Mnuchin has been great. He's been probably the glue that holds this together because he can talk to both sides of it, very rational guy. So assuming we get another stimulus program and people recognize that, then that's going to be the catalyst for everybody surviving and getting better going forward.
Congress passed 4 bipartisan laws in a fairly short amount of time. So the first bill we passed gave billions of dollars to try to find a cure, either through a drug therapy or through a vaccine. Second bill we passed put in provisions for emergency paid medical and sick leave. We also mandated that testing had to be free, and we put in some food security provisions. Third was known as the CARES Act, and that had the Paycheck Protection Program that Mr. Phillips mentioned. It also had money going to hospitals. It had testing money going to states and localities. It also had stimulus checks going directly to American families, as well as unemployment insurance expansion. The fourth bill we passed was called an interim relief measure. We realized we had to get more money to the Paycheck Protection Program. So we gave over $300 billion to that program. And then we had an additional $75 billion go to hospitals and then another $25 billion for additional testing. All of those 4 bills, I believe, were important, but they were not sufficient. I think the scale of this pandemic is much larger than people had thought. And while Mitch McConnell is not there, I know the House of Representatives is there. So that's why we passed the HEROES Act, which is a second round of stimulus that's going to provide funding to many of our people at the front lines, our paramedics, firefighters, police officers, teachers, nurses. It's going to give money to cities, counties, states, and it also has money for school districts. In addition, we have additional money for hospitals and testing and stimulus checks going to Americans. So it is a important bill, and we hope the U.S. Senate will act on it soon. Now, my view of how we exit this pandemic, we ultimately need a vaccine or a drug therapy. That is going to take a while. So government now has 2 choices. We can either say, okay, we're going to stay locked down for 1 year, which I think most governments have concluded is unsustainable, or we have to reopen. And the question is, how do you reopen safely? My view is you have to do 3 things. You've got to do testing at scale, then you have to do tracing, and then isolation. So you have to find the people who are carriers of COVID-19, you have to find who they came in contact with, and then you have to isolate them. Now, that might not work. And so you have countries that have done it, and some have done it better, some have done it worse. It's also true that in America, this virus is not evenly distributed. So the New York region was hit very hard. Wyoming was hit much less hard. So maybe you go, okay, if we have enough testing, tracing, isolation, we could figure that out. And then we go, well, for most of Wyoming, maybe we just reopen with social distancing and with masks and other appropriate measures, and we just keep New York locked down for much longer. So I think that's how we have to proceed. And it's going to take a while for the data to come in. So it's very important that the data is not manipulated. But I think most governments have taken the position that we just can't remain locked down for an entire year. That's simply not sustainable. I grew up in a small business. We had a family gift shops. My parents actually immigrated here to America, and they started out selling gifts and jewelry at flea markets to make ends meet. So I'm very aware of the issues facing small businesses, and that's one reason the 4th law that Congress got through actually took a while, because what the Republican-controlled Senate wanted to do was simply refund and just increase funding to the Paycheck Protection loan program. And we were saying in the House, no, there's problems with this program with money not going out to a lot of small businesses, especially in ethnic communities. So we fought for and got essentially carve-outs in there for CDFIs. Many small businesses don't necessarily have relationships with the big banks. So that's an issue that we're working on. But it's also a challenge just getting small business to understand that there is this program. I remember when our family was in a small business, we had no idea what a chamber of commerce was. We had no idea what really was happening in most of government. We were just trying to survive and trying to sell gifts and make sure that we had money to make payroll and so on. So it is a challenge. I think media can help with that and help small businesses know how they can apply. Also, every small business is located in a congressional district. And while our offices are physically closed, we remain open remotely, and all our staff is working. And if someone has an issue with getting a small business loan or a problem with the federal agency, we will help them. They should contact their local members of Congress's office, and we have staff ready to assist with casework. In terms of sort of looking out in the future, we just have to provide additional sustenance to the American people, both to families and to businesses. It's pretty clear to me that even if governments all across America were to lift the stay-at-home orders, we would still have a slow economy because it's the virus causing us to have a slow economy. People are simply not going to engage in a lot of activities that they previously did because they want to protect themselves and their families, and that's going to keep our economy slow until there's a drug therapy or a vaccine. One new normal is that everyone should wear masks in public. The Trump administration's Surgeon General is promoting his own video telling people to wear masks. The Centers for Disease Control urges everyone to wear masks in public. I think it's shameful and disgraceful for the President of the United States not to wear a mask in public and to post things on his social media that suggest people shouldn't wear a mask. It is a ridiculous way to govern. The president should not be confusing the American people. So wearing masks is one thing. Also doing social distancing. With every passing week, it becomes more and more unsustainable for Mitch McConnell to do nothing.
I'm a family-owned business that's been around for 33 years. That was founded by my mother, who is now 70 plus years old, in Artesia, California, which was in the heart of Little India. We, unbeknownst to ourselves, ended up creating a category and an industry within the beauty industry, which was shaping eyebrows with thread, called threading. We got knocked off and copied, and it became a global industry, which we are very proud of, actually, because it felt like we were meant to do something big, and we created an industry. We have worked really, really hard to build this brand. We had over 100 employees, servicing about 45,000 customers out of 14 studios, mostly Californias. Most of them are in Southern California. We have one in Northern California. To give you an idea of what happened the week of March 11th, we had just opened our 14th location, which was in Century City Mall, and we were planning the grand opening. And so here we are on Monday, we're coming up with ideas and who we're going to invite and what's the guest list going to look like and all of that. So Monday, we're planning a grand opening. On Wednesday, we're laying off that entire team and closing that store. And on Friday, at 6 o'clock, I had to make a very tough decision, which was that we are touch services. We get really intimate and close. We get you to sit on a barber chair, we lean you back, and then we are on top of you, removing hair from your eyebrows, which is your eye area, your upper lip, your chin, and your face area. We can't do it without touching you. And so I had to make a very difficult decision to shut down all the stores. So within half an hour, I mobilized the team, and all our stores put handwritten signs, and we closed the stores. And that was March 13th, which also happened to be my daughter's 25th birthday. So I will never forget this day. And on the 16th, which was 3 days later, I had to make I thought that decision was tough. And then I had to make an even tougher decision, which was to lay off my entire team so that they could file for unemployment. Now, you have to understand, we pay bi-monthly. So we had already paid payroll for the month of, for the first 10 days of the month. We had already paid our rent, which to the tune of, we are in mainstream malls, our rent roll is high. So to the tune of over $150,000 a month. And so we paid the rent, we'd paid our loan payments, and we'd paid one payroll. And when I laid off everybody on Monday, I ended up having to pay another final payroll, pay out everybody's vacation that had accrued, because everyone was afraid that they didn't know, they needed to cash out as much as they could, right? To do that, we had to put our personal savings into the store. And then fast forward, and then there was a week of real dirty crying. I mean, my children had to literally see me melt down at every dinner table, every breakfast, every lunch, because to me, it was like losing a family member. I did get the PPP funds. I didn't get them because I was lucky. I got them because I used every contact in my book, and I used everything in my power to make sure that, and we got approved on the 16th of April, and we didn't get our funds till last week. I know a lot of people are saying, well, we need to open. The phased opening is, in my opinion, the right approach, but there's another phase inside each category. What a hairdresser can do with safety is not the same thing as what a threading artist touch services can do. So we are probably going to be shut down longer and the longest, and I'm not going to feel comfortable opening up my stores and risking my team as well as my customers. And that stand that I'm taking is pretty much at the risk of losing a 33-year-old brand that I built literally with my own hands. I mean, if I send you a picture of my mother's hands, right, they look like this. She has developed arthritis from the years and years of threading and shaping everybody's eyebrows. My main message to all of you, touch services coming back too soon will be one of the things that ends up spreading this thing.
When COVID hit, one of the first things my team and I did was we went out to our portfolio companies and to companies around the US led and founded by women. And we said, look, tell us what your pain points are. How can we help you during COVID and after COVID? And not just that, our country's history is that women roll up their sleeves during the crisis, but then we get left behind after the crisis. And so how do we make this crisis different? How is the coronavirus different where women are out there right now? They're on the front lines, they're giving out masks, they're doctors, they're nurses. And how is it that when this crisis is over that, they still have the same access to capital? Just to give you an idea, when things are good in a good economy, women have about 2% access to capital, a venture capital that's being given out compared to a non-diverse team. So can you imagine what will happen in post-COVID era? So let me give you some examples give you some numbers and why it's so critical that women have that equal access to capital and continue to scale their businesses. One of the things that we found was that of all the companies that we surveyed, 1/3 have had to report having to furlough employees, and more than half have said that they cannot get the access to capital they need and have had to close their businesses. In the U.S. alone, women control nearly 20 trillion in assets, which is roughly 60% of personal wealth. Okay, globally, women control 36% in total assets. But if we bring it closer to home, in the US, women consumers control 85% of purchasing decisions that are made at home. There are 12.3 women-owned firms nationwide, according to research that we've done. The firms employ close to 9 million people, and they generated $1.7 trillion worth of revenue. So what does this mean? What does this mean is that if women continue to scale, not just within their own demographics, but across the US, we have the potential to increase our GDP by $500 billion. And Sunita, those are a lot of stats, and I can certainly share those afterwards if that's helpful. But really what this comes into is we cannot afford to have an economy that does not include businesses by diverse founders, especially our minority communities and especially women, because it's not good for the economy. It's the economic sense to do it, it's the right thing to do. And there's also the inclusive economy without which we cannot have a full economic recovery. In World War II, women were personified by Rosie the Riveter, and we were out in manufacturing in plants, and we were putting out supplies. And then when that was done, we were forgotten. In the Great Recession, in the most recent recession, women held more jobs than men did. And yet since then, in the last 10 years or 10 plus years, women still only get 2% of access to capital. The best thing that you can do is keep the spotlight on this issue. women, minority founders, diverse founders, we have a direct correlation between diversity and innovation, which leads to greater returns. We need to keep that dialogue going. The squeaky wheel that gets the oil, right? And so we need to be able to drive that dialogue as much as we can. And I appreciate you asking that. Alexandra, thank you. Can't hear you, Sunita. You're on mute.
Thank you for participating. Appreciate your presence here.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to run, Sunita, so thank you for having me. Take care, everyone. Good luck.
All right. Bye-bye. So Sumita, could you continue your presentation? We have a few questions for you, so hope you'll stay for that.
Yes, absolutely. So basically, I'm in a place at the moment that, one, I've got to wait this thing out. Everybody keeps asking me a question, which is, when is Ziba opening? And the only answer I have for them is, I know it's not in June. And I also, that's the only thing I can give. And